You see, with the new rules, which are all slanted to help the offense.
In 1997, Wilt Chamberlain, the 7'1" NBA superstar who revolutionized and popularized professional basketball in the 60s and 70s and paved the way for the greats that followed, sat down with his old Celtics rival Bill Russell for an interview with Bob Costas. As usual, the two men were a study in contrasts. Chamberlain was flamboyant and talkative, wearing stylish clothes and comfortably burnishing his already impressive legend with tales of his many exploits on and off the court, while Russell was more reserved and understated, at ease with his legacy as the winningest player in the league's history, with his 11 championship rings from his days with the Boston Celtics. The torch had already long since been passed from the two giants of the hard court, as the interview took place during the final chapter of Michael Jordan's illustrious career. But while Russell still had a comfortable lead over Jordan in championships that would not be caught, Chamberlain's status as the greatest individual player in league history was in jeopardy with the brilliance of Jordan, who combined all of the scoring prowess of Chamberlain with the championship pedigree of Russell. In essence, he was the best of both worlds and quickly earning GOAT status in people's minds. But Chamberlain wasn't ready to give up the title so easily, boasting about how much he'd have been able to score with the defensive rule changes that opened up the game in the 90s, and speculating he could have put up 70 points per game. It sounds outlandish until you remember he once scored 100 points in a single game and averaged more than 50 points and 25 rebounds per game in the same season. Even decades later, the stats remain eye-popping, and Wilt certainly wasn't shy about proclaiming himself the greatest of all time. And really, on an individual level, there simply hasn't been anyone close to him before or since. But just 2 years after the interview, Chamberlain, who had always been consistently resplendent in his public appearances, living up to his legend by towering over the rest of us mere mortals and looking every bit like a glamorous Hollywood star in fancy clothes and sunglasses, withdrew from public life as his health deteriorated. A man of tremendous appetites, it seemed as though life was finally catching up with Chamberlain. He'd had a history of cardiovascular disease and was briefly hospitalized 7 years earlier with an irregular heartbeat, but it looked as though he'd recovered in subsequent years and had been taking medication to address the heart issues. But in late September 1999, Wilt underwent a series of root canals in an effort to save 2 teeth, but he ended up needing a more involved dental implant surgery. Already in declining health and requiring periodic fluid draining from his legs on account of the heart issues, Wilt did not respond well to the surgery, experiencing immense pain and losing nearly 50 pounds in the aftermath of the procedure. He'd normally been impervious to pain, something that helped him during his career on the basketball court, when teams often resorted to hard fouls as the only means of slowing down his offensive production. But now his sister Barbara reported that Wilt told her he was enduring, quote, the worst pain he had ever experienced. Longtime NBA league executive Zelda Spolstra recalled a conversation with Wilt around this time, saying, quote, when he called me almost crying from the pain, that will always stay with me, and adding, he couldn't even lift a fork. On October 9th, Barbara went to his home and cooked Wilt his favorite meal from their childhood in Philadelphia, chicken and dumplings. But Wilt was tired and weak from the pain, and didn't even touch the food. Later that evening, Wilt's close friend Linda Huey arrived at his home and was distressed to see how one of the strongest people she'd ever encountered struggled to even make it up the stairs. They laid in bed, opened his famous retractable roof, and watched a movie before she left late in the evening, telling him simply, feel better, Wilty. Just 3 days later, Chamberlain was discovered lying unresponsive in his bed by a longtime gardener. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. At 12:41 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Wilt Chamberlain was just 63 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Wilt Chamberlain.
As news of Chamberlain's death spread, nearly everyone in the basketball universe, both friends and foes alike, chimed in with their condolences and paid respect to the passing of a true legend of the sport. Former teammate Jerry West remembers Chamberlain warmly from their playing days, saying, quote, "His greatness as a basketball player can't be questioned. He was fun. We used to laugh at him a lot. Some of the things that would happen. I once told him, no one roots for Goliath." Red Auerbach, who had to contend with Wilt's dominating presence on the court when he was leading the Boston Celtics to numerous championships in the 1960s, heaped praise upon Chamberlain and what he meant to the growth of the league, saying, quote, "Wilt Chamberlain had a great deal to do with the success of the NBA. His dominance, power, demeanor, and the rivalry with Bill Russell says it all. He will be sorely missed by myself and everyone in the basketball community." Russell himself kept it simple, simply saying, "The fierceness of our competition bonded us together for eternity." And emerging stars at the time, like Allen Iverson, mourned the loss of one of the game's greats, saying, quote, "We lost a legend. I was honored for him to say anything about me. It is a bad day for the sport. He was before my time. How couldn't I look up to him?" Then NBA Commissioner David Stern summed it up best, saying, quote, "We've lost a giant of a man in every sense of the word. The shadow of accomplishment he cast over our game is unlikely ever to be matched."
Even Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the greatest scorer in league history at the time, but who had a frosty relationship with Chamberlain, admitted, quote, "Wilt was one of the greatest ever, and we will never see another one like him." Jason, Kareem's strained relationship with Wilt stemmed at least in part on their different approaches to the civil rights movement. Kareem was a black activist who supported many of the positions espoused by Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, including refusal to enter the draft during the Vietnam War. Wilt was more conservative by nature. He supported Richard Nixon. He also famously made some problematic comments, including that he preferred dating white women because they were more sophisticated and smarter than black women, things that certainly haven't aged well. In 1990, Abdul-Jabbar even wrote a paper to Wilt Chamberlain in which he wrote, quote, "Now that I'm done playing, history will remember me as someone who helped teammates to win, while you will be remembered as a crybaby, a loser, and a quitter." Wilt was also not particularly complimentary when it came to comparing his dominance to Kareem's game on the court.
And if you're going to go one-on-one, you take it to the basket.
So this is a debate that's been going on forever since Wilt retired, really.
Both
or maybe even
Lakers
before that. Both Lakers.
Points in their career.
And it's not just Kareem. It's really the triumvirate, right? It's Kareem and Russell and Chamberlain. It's arguably the three greatest centers of all time. And Wilt was in a class by himself statistically, right? And you and I have talked about this. You've always pointed to Wilt. You think he's sort of a little bit been pushed out of history.
It's hard not to look at those stats and just be amazed.
And he is compared to the greatest stats ever, especially, but then there's pushback, two points of pushback. Number one, he was the only person of his stature playing at the game, right? Everybody else at the time was in 6 inches shorter, 8 inches shorter.
Even Russell
towered
was
over
6'10".
Even so, and the second point is that Wilt on his teams got dominated by Russell's. Year after year, the Lakers and Celtics, Chamberlain's Lakers, and then Chamberlain's before that 76ers, Chamberlain's Golden State Warriors would go up against these Bill Russell-led Celtics teams and get annihilated. And Russell would always outperform Chamberlain individually. So Chamberlain is considered maybe the greatest regular season player of all time, but playoff-wise, he just never pulled it. And so I think, and Chamberlain never took that well, right? He always was a man of great ego and bravado, and so he never took it well.
Yeah, he was very flamboyant persona, and he thought of himself as the greatest. He carried himself in the world in that way, and Russell was very different, and there's a very famous picture of Bill Russell, because what spoke loudest for him was his championships, and on the cover of Sports Illustrated, He's got 10 rings plus one in his hand, and no one can really say anything about that.
A memorial service for Chamberlain was held at the City of Angels Church of the Religious Science in Los Angeles on October 16th, 1999. A second service was held at his home church in Philadelphia on October 21st of that year. And in November in 1998, he had signed a deal with Northern Cinema House Entertainment to produce a biopic, insisting he wanted to tell his life story on his terms. He had reportedly been working on the screenplay notes for over a year at the time of his death.
There are only a handful of professional athletes who truly evoke a sensation of awe and amazement, usually reserved for mythological figures and comic book superheroes. Babe Ruth certainly fits the bill, and Muhammad Ali became a living legend for his exploits in boxing, at least before the sad end of his career when he suffered a few embarrassing bouts to lesser competition after suffering years of abuse in the ring. And in basketball, that person is undoubtedly Wilt Chamberlain. Regarded as one of the most extraordinary and dominant talents ever to pick up a basketball, many historians still put him at the top of their list as the single greatest NBA player of all time, perhaps even ahead of Michael Jordan and LeBron James. Standing 7'1" and blessed with extraordinary strength and athleticism, Chamberlain towered over the smaller competition of the day and absolutely crushed everyone in the league to the point that Walt Frazier, the Hall of Fame guard for the New York Knicks at the time, called Chamberlain's dominance on the court, quote, comical.
So we talked a little bit earlier about contextualizing his stats, but nevertheless, I think it's important to run through them to talk about just how dominant he was. Many of his eye-popping statistical records still stand to this day, which truly puts him even beyond Babe Ruth in terms of dominance. Ruth's 60 home run season in 1927, when no other American League team even reached that total, boggled the minds of baseball historians for years. But Roger Maris and later several stars of the muscled-up steroid era eclipsed the mark. Wilt Chamberlain's records still exist in a realm that still seems wildly out of reach. He won 4 MVP awards and finished in the top 5 another 6 times. He led the league in scoring 7 times, field goal percentage 9 times, minutes played 8 times, rebounding 11 times, and even led the league in assists once. He retired as the all-time scoring champion, top rebounder, highest field goal percentage, although several of these records have since been passed, just the longevity of players today. One record that will likely never be caught is his 100-point game against the Knicks, which is widely considered one of the most untouchable feats in sports, along with Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hit streak. Never lacking in confidence, Wilt would later say the Knicks were doing everything they could to stop him. He said, quote, scoring 100 points is a lot. I maybe could have scored 140 if they had played straight-up basketball. Chamberlain also bristled at the notion that he played a selfish brand of basketball, saying, quote, when you go out there and do the things you're supposed to do, people view you as selfish. They don't look at you that way if you're O.J. Simpson or Eric Dickerson or Walter Payton and you're trying to get as many yards as you can every time you touch the football. But when you're a scorer in basketball, you get labeled a gunner or a selfish player.
I looked at that quote when I was researching this, and there is a truth to it. I remember Allen Iverson often had to deal with this. He was seen as a guy who was a gunslinger. He's just the most talented scorer on the team. Wilt Chamberlain had to score those points. He was surrounded by guys that he was clearly better than, and he filled up the stat sheet. It wasn't as if he didn't play defense. Now, you're right. When he played against Russell, he often, some of his weaknesses were exposed. A lot of times people said he didn't put forth the effort that Bill Russell did. But you can't argue with when you see his stat lines. He rebounded. Although, he didn't measure block shots, but he blocked a ton of shots.
His football analogy is a little silly, right? When you hand the ball to Walter Payton, the whole team is invested on him going forward as many yards as he can. When you pass the ball to your basketball teammate, there's a goal of him either to score or pass it back to somebody with a better shot opportunity.
And it often didn't go back out.
It often didn't go back out. I mean, yes.
There were no kickouts for three-pointers. It was a different game.
It was a different game, but there was a lot of passing involved, obviously. This is something that great superstars have been criticized for forever, right? Michael Jordan was criticized in this way. Kobe Bryant, certainly maybe the most prime example of somebody who, people didn't always like to pass from the ball because they didn't get it back, but Wilt was built from the same mold.
Yeah, look, I mean, Kobe is sort of the heir apparent in terms of scoring prowess. He had the 81-point game, the only person who's ever really challenged that 100-point game. But the record Chamberlain himself was probably proudest of was his stat line during the 1961-62 season, when he averaged 50.4 points per game, 25.7 rebounds per game, and played, get this, Jason, 48.5 minutes per game, which is actually greater than the length of a regulation basketball game because he also played some overtime minutes. The man never sat down. It's such an incredible now that we're in the era of load management for marquee players where you sit them to preserve their energy for the playoffs, it's just unfathomable to imagine any player, let alone a superstar center at that size, not getting a rest during the game.
Just a little bit of context, right? So he averaged 50.4 points a game. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe that Michael Jordan, and as great as Michael Jordan was, and in most people's opinion, the greatest ever, I believe his highest scoring season ever was 37, maybe.
Something around there, yeah.
And so Chamberlain getting 50 in a season is bonkers. And at the same time, averaged 25 rebounds a game, also bonkers. It goes to the fact that, critics will always point out,
the level of
the
competition.
Size advantage over the other players was really dramatic. And so maybe it wouldn't be the same as somebody in today's NBA getting that same rebounding totals. But you can't deny him the points. I mean, just the fact he shot. And I believe the reason he was able to average so many minutes per game was he never fouled out. Wasn't that a thing?
Yes.
He never ever fouled out of a game.
Fouled out of a basketball
which is something
game.
No other player who plays for even a season or two will inevitably foul out of a game or two.
Especially a center who the bodies are just banging around constantly. It's not as if he played in a spread offense. And, blocks weren't recorded during his playing days, but the unofficial statistics about his prowess in this regard are easy to come by. Sixers general manager Jack Ramsey said they used to tell statisticians to track blocks in his big games, and one night counted 25 of them. Even in the 1970s, during the twilight of his career with the Lakers, unofficial reports show he averaged around 8.8 blocks per game.
Which, by the way, would lead today's NBA by like 5 blocks per game. I think maybe 3 will lead the NBA, and he was getting 8.8 per game.
It's unbelievable. He played so many minutes, also, to your point, without foul trouble. He only averaged 1.5 fouls per game during an era when those bodies were banging around in the paint.
Wilt was enshrined in the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame in 1978, named one of the 50 greatest players in NBA history in 1996, and pops up on every list of the greatest players of all time, usually alongside other legends like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Russell, Michael Jordan, and Oscar Robertson. But few of the other greats caused lasting rule changes to the sport itself. Chamberlain's dominance was directly responsible for several rule changes, including a widening of the lane to keep big men further from the basket, the institution of offensive goaltending rules, a ban on dunking to convert free throws, and a revision of the rules governing inbounding of the ball to make it illegal to inbound over the backboard. Nobody transformed the game more, save for perhaps George Mikan at the very dawn of the NBA. The biggest knock on Wilt Chamberlain's game came from his rivalry with Bill Russell, who frustrated Wilt in the postseason, as we discussed, en route to securing numerous championships with the Boston Celtics during the 1960s. The comparison makes sense. The battles between the two big men were the premier attraction for the fledgling league. Russell won 5 MVPs to Chamberlain's 4, but the real disparity came in NBA championships, with Russell winning 11 of them and Chamberlain's 2, and Chamberlain won, I believe, one of them when he was old and no longer the best player on his team.
Really a Jerry West title.
It's Jerry West title, right. Russell's Celtics won 7 of 8 playoff series against Chamberlain's teams and won all 4 series-deciding Game 7s they played.
The rivalry's really been distilled into a narrative that Chamberlain was the better individual player, while Russell was the better team player. But that's always struck me as a bit oversimplified. Russell focused almost exclusively on defense and rebounding because the Celtics had plenty of scorers at other positions. Chamberlain insisted his job was actually much harder because his teams absolutely depended on him for offense and defense. He would say, quote, "I've got to hit 40 points or so or this team is in trouble. I must score, understand? After that, I play defense and get the ball off the boards. I try to do them all best I can, but scoring comes first." And he had a point. Chamberlain actually outscored and out-rebounded Russell in the regular season and playoffs, putting up 26 points and 28 rebounds per game in the playoffs to Russell's 15 points and 25 rebounds. Eye-popping numbers. Still, the point of the game is winning championships, and the loser label chased Chamberlain around during his NBA career and afterwards. Hall of Famer Rick Barry said, quote, "I'll say what most players feel, which is that Wilt is a loser. He is terrible in big games. When it comes down to the closing minutes of a tough game, an important game, he doesn't want the ball. He doesn't want any part of the pressure. It is at these times that greatness is determined, and Wilt doesn't have it." He went on to say, quote, "There's no way you can compare him to a pro like Bill Russell or Jerry West. These are clutch competitors."
Ouch. That
stinging
hurts.
words, and Rick Barry was a great himself.
Rick Barry's a Hall of Famer himself, top 50 all-time player himself, and to hear that is brutal. I will say that Chamberlain's point about I had to score because my team needed me to score to win, it's sort of what everybody who wants to shoot all the time and wants to score says. Kobe Bryant said the same kind of thing. Allen Iverson, people were talking about. They said the same thing because Wilt Chamberlain loved,
but he didn't have a Bob Cousy.
He didn't.
He didn't have those other greats.
So I give him that, but it's also an unavoidable fact that he loved attention, and the flamboyant outfits, the outrageous statements. There's a through
They're
line.
all of a piece.
The through line through them all, right? He loved the attention on himself, and I think it did ultimately make him a less great teammate when he finally got older and was surpassed by Jerry West as the talent on the floor, because Chamberlain, again, never took care of his body. A lot of players back then didn't, and aged pretty quickly. That's when he became a much better player.
Yes.
When he actually became a passer, and that's when he won his championship, because that's what it took to win, and he never really wanted to see that early on. Whether or not he would have beaten those great Celtics teams aside.
Yeah.
Although the comments about his professional shortcomings may have wounded his ego, Wilt never let the comments dim his flamboyant public persona. He was truly the game's first superstar and big earner, becoming the first player to earn at least $100,000 in a season and taking in a then unprecedented $1.5 million during his Laker years. He built a huge mansion in Bel Air where he signed with the Lakers, naming it Ursa Major as a play on his nickname, the Big Dipper. The house was like a mini Playboy mansion, with an X-rated room filled with mirrored walls and a fur-covered waterbed. He regularly hosted parties and had a legendary number of sexual partners. In Chamberlain's second book titled A View from Above, he famously claimed to have had sex with 20,000 women during his life. There were so many thought pieces, sort of maybe more informal, about doing the math on
that number as a kid. He's done the math.
Yeah. He would document his love life using a day timer. Every time he had sex with a different woman, he would put a check in his day timer. Over a 10-year period, there were 23 checks in the book, meaning a rate of 2.3 different women per day.
The fact that he applied this statistical analysis to how many
makes it
women
more
he was
believable,
dating
if
does
nothing
give it a
else.
level of credence.
Chamberlain then cut that number in half in an effort to provide a conservative estimate, multiplied that number by the number of days he'd been alive past the age of 15 when he started having sex, and came up with the 20,000 figure.
You know, Jason, even decades before the Me Too era, there was enormous public backlash over his tales of sexual promiscuity. Chamberlain would later defend the number, saying, quote, "The point of using the number was to show that sex was as great a part of my life as basketball was a great part of my life. That's the reason why I was single." But he would also later warn men about the pitfalls of his lifestyle, saying, quote, "With all of you men out there who think that having 1,000 different ladies is pretty cool, I have learned in my life that having one woman 1,000 different times is much more satisfying." He had a way with words. Despite his change of heart, Chamberlain never married and always maintained he had no intention of raising children. I bring this up because it's a huge part of the lore of Wilt Chamberlain that he had said he had sex with 20,000 women, but he was single and he was very, very famous, and he was a cad in a certain way, but he wasn't out there philandering. And I think that's an important thing to remember. What do you think?
So look, I don't know, and I don't care, and I'm not going to pass judgment on Wilt Chamberlain. He lived his life. We all do the best we can to be happy, and he found it in whatever way he found it. You don't have to be a great dude to be a great basketball player.
That's right.
He really was. And by the way, there were a lot of people who loved Wilt Chamberlain a lot. He had great friends, and people spoke kindly about him after he died. And I take that, you take the good, and maybe you take the bad with him. Maybe he wasn't a great teammate, but he was nothing if not interesting.
He was a fascinating figure. And, so much of his legacy is built around that longstanding professional rivalry we've discussed with Bill Russell. In many ways, Russell's relentlessly team-oriented philosophy and commitment to winning stood in stark contrast to Chamberlain's self-mythologizing and steadfast focus on individually dominating the sport and his competitors. Of course, viewing either man in this way is overly simplistic and reductive. Russell certainly cared about his individual stats and recognition as one of the greats of the game. And Chamberlain did chase titles in his later years with the Los Angeles Lakers and was never content to just pad his numbers on losing teams. Regardless of their temperamental differences, though, no two men defined these early decades of professional basketball quite like Russell and Chamberlain. And perhaps surprising to some, the two men built an incredible bond from their frequent clashes on the court. And so I thought it only fitting to give the final word to Bill Russell, heard here reflecting on Chamberlain's death and their deep friendship.
He dies, I will be Charlie Russell's baby boy.